welcome everyone. My name is Giovanna Gassage and I'm the Chief Librarian. Let me properly introduce you to our speaker, who of course is speaking today on the book Ports, Crime and Security, Governing and Policing Seaports in a Changing World. So, a little about Anna. Anna Sergi holds a Ph.D. in sociology with a specialization in criminology from the University of Essex, where she currently is a professor. She specializes in organized crime and comparative criminal justice, especially through her research on the mobility of the, and forgive me if I say this wrong, the 'Ndrangheta or Calabrian Mafia. More recently, she's focused on drug importations through seaports. She has published extensively in renowned journals and has authored 5 books, with a 6th book forthcoming in 2022 and a 7th co-authored book expected in 2023. So you've been quite prolific, Anna. She is currently also acting as a consultant for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, GI Talk, on their project Hotspot 4, Maritime Balkan Routes, a risk assessment of Southeastern European commercial ports. And I actually know that that is a region that we actually follow quite closely with our colleagues in the container program. So without further ado, I will pass things on to Anna, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Giovanna, and welcome everyone. I can't see who you are, but I hope there will be time for questions later on. So I will share my screen now, and hopefully we'll manage to start. Okay, so can you see my screen correctly? Yes, hopefully. Okay, so as Giovanna said, this book is a co-author book, which we have written. It's been published in 2021. It's 4 authors, not co-edited book, which means that we all worked on each chapter, plus the introduction and conclusion have been sort of shared. As a first author, I wrote the introduction and conclusion and obviously revised it all and guided my colleagues mostly in terms of sticking to the deadlines and handling the conversation with the publisher. So the book is a very short book, and actually I should have done this before, sorry. But in case you still see me, this is the book. So it's a very short book. It's we wanted to have an agile kind of product. And the reason for that is because we think this is a topic that, even if it's very interesting and it's going to be living, it's going to have a long shelf life. However, it still needs to be fairly dynamic because it's kind of like talking about very current situations. So the chapters are 4, the main chapters, plus, as I said, introduction and conclusion. And the chapters are the ones you see in the slides. And the first one is sort of introductory theoretical chapter. The second one looks at some of the data on the policing side, and I'll go into each of them more separately. The third one looks at the security element of governing ports. And the fourth one looks at some of the future dilemmas of port security, especially when it comes to very recent issues, such as the China-US trade war and COVID or Brexit. So the idea for this book came out of a workshop which was organized by myself, actually funded by the British Academy within my project Secure Port. But 4 authors took place in May 2020. The workshop brought together 16 practitioners and 9 researchers over 7 countries, all in port policing, port security, organized crime, and border control. It was a great effort, which we had to do online, unfortunately, but initially was supposed to be a 2 days workshop in London. So the book takes a political economy perspective, meeting criminology. I'm a criminologist, but my colleagues with whom I brought this book are from, again, economic sociology, political economy, management studies. We place at the core of this book the space of the port, and we look at the port as a multivalent space, as a local space, so in between global forces and local dilemmas. We take into consideration our knowledge and the knowledge before us on complex governance structures of the port, the issues of cooperation, coordination, and privacy. And we look at the main dilemma of the security versus trade, whereby security is often seen as a cost of a more efficient trade and very smooth trade. We do consider, but we do not dwell that much into cybersecurity and technological advancement, even if that was very much something that came out of our workshop. We do take some steps into understanding which are the blind zones of security imports, and especially the so-called insider threat corruption. We use one of my favorite framework, the one that I've used in my previous research on these topics, which is to look at the port as a sort of gate between the city and the sea. So understanding the interface and the interconnections between the port and the city and the port and the sea will tell us quite a big deal about the policing and the governance of ports. As I said, this book is one of the last ones, it's the last effort that I made together with my colleagues, but in a way, it's kind of the end point of a project which is ending in December this year, which is called Secure Port, and is funded by the British Academy, which took me around the world to do research fieldwork in different ports, and which has resulted in different kind of publication, from a report, the Port Crime Interface, to different publications online on specific aspects of this. The ports that I visited are, so far, actually, are these ones, Genova and Gioia Tauro as my first initial ports, and actually the picture you see behind me as my screensaver today is the port of Gioia Tauro, which is basically where I grew up. So it's a port that is very dear to my, my life and my upbringing in a way, and kind of shaped my understanding of many things, including the 'Ndrangheta and the Calabrian Mafia, as some of you might know. But Genova is the biggest Italian port, so it was the pilot port of this project, to which I added Melbourne, Montreal, New York, and New Jersey, Liverpool, and then in a second instance in 2021, in between the various lockdowns, I've added Felixstowe, and I just went to Belfast last week. I'm going to the Piraeus in January, and I'm building my contacts there to do exactly pretty much the same thing that I've done for other ports. The best thing about ports are ports. I can't stress this enough. I'm absolutely in love with the terminal buildings and all the cranes and all the infrastructure that make every port fairly different from one another. So the one you see obviously behind me and in the picture here is Gioia Tauro, which is a port with nothing behind, a very peculiar kind of port with a very extensive dry port, if one wants to think about it, but it's really strange because the dynamics of the port in its very global dimensions do not match the dynamics of the land behind. The second one you see with the lighthouse is, which is called the Lantern, is Genova. Genova is one of the oldest ports probably in the world. Genova is built around the port, and that kind of gives a different perspective to the way the port interacts with the city. The port of New York, New Jersey, this is Port Elizabeth that you see on the bottom left, my bottom left. And in the middle is the port of Gioia Tauro, again with the MSC Samar, the second biggest ship of the world, container ship. Also, I've been told, and the one with the romantic walk to the crane is the port of Melbourne. So each port is different, and I've learned as a criminologist, as a cultural criminologist myself, I've learned that the space around the port and the way the port actually looks like kind of tells a story on its own. But going back to the book, So the book is, as I said, divided in 4 different chapters. The first is on the economy, institutions, and society, and it functions as a theoretical framework, exploring the port economy and how the port economy peculiarities establish, essentially, we can establish the foundation through the port economy of the political economy of port security approach, which we do in this book. So we assume the port political economy in a broad interdisciplinary sense. We look essentially at how ports are shaped by local, national, and international factors of the economy that operate not in isolation but affect one another. So ports are interconnected even when cities where the ports are not that interconnected. This is the port economy is an economy of its own. And in order to disentangle these factors, the first part of the chapter observes how ports are embedded in global trade networks and shaped by the national and local institutional framework. And how does this work when we try and outline the different role of individual and collective actors in the port economy? The first chapter, I should say, was primarily drafted by Dr. Luca Storti, who is an associate professor at the University of Turin of economic sociology. And obviously, as I said, we all worked on each chapter, but each chapter as a lead author. The second chapter, which has me as a lead author again, provides a framework for analyzing large-scale organized and complex criminality. I do not like the word organized crime in the sense of ports because I feel that the challenges of crime in the port go way beyond organized crime. So if we want to think of organized crime as trafficking, organizational crime as forms of collusion on corruption on the waterfront, and obviously different type of illicit governance in the port, then we could simply talk about complex crime because they involve different type of activities, different type of more serious and less serious, and more harmful, less harmful type of crime, and more or less local in reach. So in this chapter, I chose to reflect on different case studies from all the different ports I visited on the different scale of the crime. So from importation of drugs all the way to illicit governance, essentially, of in the port. And I reflect on the challenges to police this type of crime, reflecting on how hybrid is the policing, where you need to basically look at the global perspective sometimes of cross-border crime mixed in with very local dimensions of criminality. So that's why it's hybrid rather than plural policing. It's not just that many different institutions do many different things at the port, but each institution has to do more than one thing to police the port. And then it concludes with an analysis of the consequences this has for local partnership. And with local partnership, we give way to the third chapter, which was primarily curated by Professor Marleen Easton at the University of Ghent. Marleen has been working on port security for a while. She works on security networks more generally. So she gives us the main vocabulary used in the governance of security, essentially looking at what does it mean to speak about flows, nodes, plural policing, nodal governance, polycentric system, partnership networks, assemblage, regulation, hybridity, and accountability. So this vocabulary is necessary to do any research on security governance in ports. And we argue that if we understand ports as hubs in a multitude of flows, ports as ambivalent hybrid spaces, plural policing, which means having different police forces next to one another, doing hybrid policing, are obviously forming a map of a network which needs to be studied in each different nodes, because each of them institution in the network will provide different types of security to the port. And the way these security networks, the way these institutions regulate one another and talk to one another and are accountable to one another, they take different shapes in different ports. The fourth chapter of the book looks at the future of port security and is being curated primarily by Alexandria Reed. Alexandria is a senior research fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Institute for the United Services Institute for Defense Studies. I mean, it's a think tank, very well-known think tank in London that does work on from the defense to security to organized crime. And Alexandra has been particularly involved in some research on the new free ports in the UK. So she's been working on, again, the political economy of the ports. So she looks at how ports, obviously as dynamic spaces, must capitalize on social, political, and economic and technological change to remain competitive. So by looking at how ports compete with one another, we can identify some opportunities for further offending as well. So this chapter tries to look how the political economy approach of this book provides a useful lens to evaluate forces that in the future might shape port security. So, for example, we discussed the long shadow of the ISPS code. So the ISPS code is the code that regulates port security internationally, but we argue it's been extremely fallacious when it comes to organized crime, because it sees the threat of security within the port space as mainly a product of terrorism or even stowaways. So it's been obviously the ISPS code comes in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, so it doesn't surprise that it does have different kind of priorities, but we argue that it's absolutely just a tick boxing exercise. When it comes to organized crime, it doesn't do anything. So we need to consider the politicization of the international regimes and the ways in which local priorities are handled in port, and how does that affect the maritime. So for example, when we look at how certain, what type of flags a ship might decide to wear, what type of economic linkages different shipment companies might have, will affect the way the sea sees the port in a way. So we then turn to technology, digitalization, and automation, because obviously there is growing attention to smart ports as well as smart anything else in our society. And this is a challenge, but also an opportunity for port security. So we do include some consideration on cybersecurity as the so-called emergent threat, the way practitioners see it, and the changing nature of corruption, vulnerabilities in the port. Most importantly, we conclude by looking at how the growing input of technology and digitalization and automation might eventually look at the displacement of organized crime activities into the logistics supply chain in the port city hinterland. So instead of having organized crime manifest inside the port, we see organized crime use the port logistics supply chain and manifest outside. So basically, in clearer terms, instead of having cocaine taken out of a container in a port terminal, we increasingly see the container being taken out of the terminal through companies already existing or set up for purpose. So the port city hinterland area will be important. So just to give some extra thought on what I just said, as I said, we place a lot of importance on the dimension and the spatial configurations of the ports, the local and the global. And we look at issues such as access to the port, physical territory of the port, social territory of the port, and economic settings. And obviously, depending on whether we put on a local or a global lens, the port appears in a different way. At the local level, the port is a gate. It will have a barrier, it will have a door to entry. At the global level, the port is a shipping hub. Anyone can deliver, anyone can depart, as long as you engage with the shipping company in a way, shipping economy. As a physical territory, the port is often an inward border, so it's a border with the city, while at the global level, the port is an outward border, is a border with the sea. At the social territory, the port is a space of relationship. Both public and private actors engage in the port. For example, in the port of New York, New Jersey, you have 19 institutions, all of which have some sort of say in the security and policing of the port. So they do create relationship. People will know one another. But also the social territory of the port as a global lens. So it's a space for international governance. So it's a space where different international entities, such as, for example, the UN, will have an eye on. As an economic settings, obviously at the local level, the port is a space for investment, is a space for employment. It will have companies from the different states employing different people in the port, or sending different people to do business in the port, or even investing in, let's say, infrastructure of the port. And at the global level, as I said, the port is a node in the global chain. That means, for example, the port can be sold to very, very far away companies and corporations. Just take the case of Piraeus, which is now owned by COSCO. So obviously it is a very important economic investment for COSCO, but also for at the global level, but also at the local level for the companies around Piraeus. So we take into consideration how ports and also dry ports behind are completely embedded in models of capitalism. So on one side, we have obviously ports depending on the global trading network and global production network and the global supply chain. And we've seen with what happened in the Suez Canal, what happens when one of these global networks falls apart. Okay, so what happens when we interrupt one of the chains? So we do take quite a big look, an important look to the dry ports and to the logistic activities and the cluster of production behind the ports. And now, obviously, those are dependent on institutional framework at the territorial and national level, together with the global economic tendencies and the path dependency. As I said, if one of the chains breaks down, the others will obviously have issues. Ports are phenomenal, and even if these slides looks really dry, I can tell you that obviously when you look, this has a real life impact. So these images will show you different modes of connectivity between the port, the dry port, the industrial district, and the city, essentially. So what type of connection there could be: road connection, rail connection. So essentially, how far is the port from the city? How is it connected? Where is the industrial district? Where is the production cluster? We analyze different ports, and essentially each port is unique in a way. Even if they all can be looked at through different lenses, through the same lenses, they are all different. So the way you walk through the port, the way you take rails to go to the port, even from a visual perspective. So I've done, for example, in my methodology, I've included narratives of walks, so walking criminology methodologies, so narrating to myself how does it look like to walk towards the port, for example, if you can walk, to what extent you can walk, where is the dry port start, where do you feel the port starting. So it's quite a beautiful research in a way, even if it looks like very dry here. So different kind of ports could be very isolated, could be extremely connected, could be integrated, depending on how they look like with the city. And obviously, the institutional side of it has, as I said already, but just to go a little bit into more details, you will have different type of formal rules, conventions, but also informal rules that will determine how the port environments will look like from the outside. So what type of urban context and external areas surround the port? So what is the territorial setting? What kind of port administration model? Most of the ports we looked at are landlord port, but the UK, for example, has fully privatized port. This has different type of models. So there are no port administrations in the UK, for example, differently from other countries. So the ownership of the port structure, so whether or not you have sheds, warehouses, ship-to-shore handling equipment, and obviously the dock labor condition, which will impact the way the port administration reacts, for example, even to security issues. Governing and controlling bodies, whether or not there is a port authorities, whether or not there are port securities agencies, and how they impact one another, how they manage one another, and they don't step on each other's foot. And the private actors, whether these are stevedoring firms, cargo handling companies, shipping companies. So even if these are highly regulated environments, we found a lot of informalities. Everyone knows each other, and this has an impact for the criminal side of the story. As I said, we very much insist on looking at the port-sea interface and the port-sea interface as manifestations and as opportunities even for criminal behavior. In the port city interface, we find different type of actors and indicators. For example, what type of commerce and trade agreements at sea impact that port? What type of shipping routes are in that port? So we spent a lot of time, for example, being addicted in my case to marinetraffic.com, whether you can actually see the live boats and the live ships docking or leaving a port, for example. So what type of ships docks into a port? What's the length of the journey? How many stops do they do? What kind of frequency? This will impact, for example, on known or less known maritime economy companies that will invest into a port, the different type of corruption levels, and how they handle corruption internally, the effectiveness of border control institution, of course, the Coast Guard primarily when it comes to the sea, and existing criminal networks at sea. The port city interface will look like, for example, we look at transport links, how easy it is to leave the port through rail or roads, the port infrastructures, so including the dry ports facility, security devices, barrier fences, or whether or not it's easy enough. How far can you go into the port without someone stopping you? And believe me, in certain ports, you'd be surprised how far can you go before someone stops you, even in heavily securitized ports. Public and private contracts in the port for construction services, for different type of, for running a bar within the port, for example. So who gets those contracts? How interesting is the port economy within the local area to the city? What kind of, again, what kind of policies for trade, commerce and security affect the port, whether or not there are national institutional framework that change, for example, like in the UK, now that you have 10 different ports, how does that affect the economy of the city behind those ports? And different forms of extra-legal governance. To this, I'm particularly referring, for example, to cases of in New York City, historical cases in Melbourne of, let's say, organized crime influence over the unions, for example, of labor racketeering. So there are different type of legacies of those behaviors in all ports, and these depend on the way organized crime acts outside the port as well. We look at, how can I put it, a framework which is very dear to me because I've coined this framework for my mafia research, for the mobility of mafias. It works generally for mobility of organized crime. So the organized crime in ports is only conditionally successful. So its success is dictated by a form of condition opportunism, which means how successful is the trade, whether licit or illicit. For example, the resilience of a shipment route can ensure the longevity of the trade. And obviously this will impact organized crime. The reason, for example, why recently we are seeing increasing seizures, increasing arrivals of cocaine in the port of Dublin might be linked to the fact, it's probably linked to the fact that 50% of the European trade to the UK now has moved to Ireland because of the Brexit disruption. So obviously, if there is more trade going to Ireland, there will be more illicit trade as well. So the capacity of criminal network to adapt to abrupt changes is what we see. So we can assume that the moment in which the illicit trade change, some organized crime groups will adapt better than others. They will understand how to exploit the storage units in the dry ports, for example, how they could implement new ways and new rhythms in narcotic distribution, new ports and new routes if necessary. The ability of local and global actors to enter certain business, for example, is something that condition the port on the side of policing and on the side of security. So whether or not the port workforce has developed form of extra-legal governance, whether or not there is, for example, there are criminal actors at the local level that can exploit the port workforce, the dockers, or whether the workforce actors or in certain countries are easily to infiltrate or corrupt. This can facilitate large-scale criminality at sea. But on the contrary, if none of this is there, then the port economy might be more difficult to penetrate. And the resource and capabilities of law enforcement agencies, including security and policing, whether or not they work well with one another, whether or not there is a clear indication of priorities and tasks. Oops, I don't know what happened. Sorry. Okay. Security and law enforcement at the port, there are many, too many actually, institutions. You can find terminal security teams, so from the bottom up, you find normally different private sector security firms. If not, like in the case of the UK, port police, which are a very strange form of police, because they have the power of the police in England and Wales, but at the same time they are hired by the private sector. So whether or not they ensure the smooth movement of goods and people by monitoring access, by keeping the peace, by performing daily security duties in different ways. Port Authority security units, these are available in some ports but not in other, depending how the Port Authority looks like, and they do security protocols for all the ports in the same area. They might be the person who responds to national and international obligation, and they might be training port security officers. Municipal, local investigative team, these are usually community policing, local police. They normally have knowledge of the city's criminal landscape, and now it spills over to the port. And they should be able to cooperate. They don't always cooperate with provincial or regional police forces when they are there, who run more intelligence-led policing of the province, of the area, so they might be able to see what happens when a group comes to the port city and the port from a different place in the region, so they will be able to base their intelligence on a bigger scale. And then obviously federal police or national or state police, depending on who is there, who normally look at things from the above and are able to identify targets, also usually cross-border. Customs and border agencies are the ones that normally do the checks. They are the ones who normally are able to enter the port, to access the port terminal for screening of containers. They are usually a mix of law enforcement and border control issues, or law enforcement and customs, so it depends on the system. And just to go towards the end, some final thoughts. The privatization of security at terminals and the focus on productivity do not go on the same path. So security is still seen as a cost, and is not often the case that even when obviously terminals do implement security, their priority still remains productivity. So this poses issues for security on the security side. Most of the time there will be the main need of port security and port authorities is to control industrial action, to control the unions, and essentially to protect the reputation for terminal. There is a conflation of safety of the port with security of the port, which safety and security are not the same things, and this kind of shows in the way port security is understood by the port authorities. Safety is mostly about the personal safety of workers. There is a dispersal of power, nodal and hybrid governance that bring different security network confederation. A multitude of agencies doesn't always work well, also because they are not always able to share data between one another. The problem of controlling access to the port, which starts as a security matter. So the kind of biometrics that needs to be in an access card, the kind of surveillance mechanism, CCTVs and all sorts of that, becomes often a policing matter. So that's why I mean this is what I mean when I say the different institutions will have different tasks, some of which are security, some of which are policing. And obviously technological advancement is believed to be one way to streamline flows and control access. At the level of policing, we cannot fight illicit trade. in the port, because that would mean stopping illicit trade, and that's not an option. So there is a threshold of tolerability for crime in the port, and the focus on lower level target is often the one that is pursued. So we do know, police forces do know that crime will happen, that drug importation will continue, that illicit trade will continue. There is a threshold of tolerability. In a nutshell, they don't want to seize too much, and they don't want not to seize enough, which is interesting when you actually look at what is the output and the input, in a way, also of police forces. The focus on lower level target is usually by showing off seizures at the port, not because seizures are not important, but because obviously seizures are something that can be easily understood as police action, whereby intelligence behind the seizures, even when the seizures does not happen, but it does still give some intelligence for the law enforcement agencies to work with, is not easily sellable to the public. Changing nature of traffic poses a constant threat to policing. Different commodities will serve different markets and different doors, different exit points and entry points in the local territory. Different keys to the port will help trafficking routes, and this is essentially what I called the Pac-Man job. So going around up and down in all different directions, chasing the traffickers around. And there is obviously a problem of jurisdiction for the policing agencies. Multi-agency work is the only way to go. Sometimes the port, as I said, might be fully privatized, or even when they are landlord ports, they still sit across different jurisdictions. The Port of Melbourne, for example, sits across 3 different municipalities. So it's really difficult for agencies to understand whose territory is it when they have to act in the port. So the only way is usually multi-agency work, or having the state police act instead of the regional ones. And just to finish off, again, the ambivalent dimensions of the port, as I said, do bring some extra challenges to what is already very complex policing responses to crime, to organized crime. At the local level, organized crime intended as illicit trafficking will pose a problem of law policing. So looking for individual in corruption, looking for access and entry and exit point. And obviously, it's really a matter of controlling the space. But the illicit trafficking is also a matter for global attention of police, and for high policing in the sense of intelligence-led policing of transport and shipping opportunities. Organizational crime, so infiltration in the legal economy. The port will at the local level might develop, or might be desirable for cartels of entrepreneurs, private actors that liaise with one another, or with organized crime group, with systematic corruption against competition, so to intimidate possible competitors in, let's say, a contract to build the railway around the port. Organized crime initiative need to be understood in line with initiative of organized crime in the city, so both in the port and in the city, and this is a matter for regional and state police. But also at the same time, global trade will call for international traders and international investors, and this leads to high policing efforts. And when it comes to extralegal governance, so influence over the port union or the port administration malfunctioning, this is not fully organized crime in the sense of, obviously, in the normal sense, but it can become whether or not you are trafficking favors, for example. So in certain institutions, in certain jurisdiction, this is still organized crime. And this again requires hybrid policing. When it comes to criminal intelligence, obviously, there are different types of things to consider. When it comes to crime, criminal intelligence will help authorities to build trusted insiders network in their supply chains. So who are the companies that access the port regularly? How long have they been around? Can we do due diligence checks around them? And obviously, this will build, again, the reputation of the insiders of the port. the economic interest of the port, in and around the port, around the freight forwarders, the transport, the logistics, whoever enters in and around the port from an economic perspective is subjected to criminal intelligence search. The political interest around the port, obviously, what kind of interest there are at the construction level for different corporations, different investments, different union relationships. This should all be part of the criminal intelligence. It doesn't always. And obviously the corruption, low-level corruption, individual corruption, occasional corruption, whether or not corruption can enable border crime is obviously always part of a very, very difficult conversation the law enforcement engaging in criminal intelligence will have to have with the port authorities. In conclusion, we have all of this is a framework for us to understand the change and the continuity of the port economy and the port security, even in the case of shock events. It is likely, for example, that with Brexit or COVID, Matthew effect will occur. So large ports will become larger, while small and medium ports might scale down, thereby further concentrating policing and security activity in large ports will become essentially more attractive for small ports will become more attractive for certain type of activities. So we argue essentially that the more we focus on larger ports, the more obviously smaller and medium ports will emerge as points of concern. Changing border and changing legal routes, as I said already, the existing of a different type of border, of a European border within Ireland, even if it's not a hard border, will change the dynamics of the trafficking. The existence of the Irish Sea border will change the dynamics of the trade between the UK and Ireland. It has already done so. The different customs agreement in Ireland have already shifted attention on a criminal nature towards Ireland, and this is something that concerns very much Northern Ireland authorities for unobvious reasons. Ireland is obviously coming out of a transition period when it comes to organized crime, where many organized crime groups used to engage with paramilitary activities during the conflict, and obviously no one wants organized crime to be armed again or to take in a way more of a foot in the economy of Northern Ireland for the sake of illicit trade in Great Britain as well. So port city interface for port governance is a way that we argue could always help authorities to look at these issues. It's necessary to involve downstream intermediaries in the city that have an impact on the port economy and management as well. Without that, it's very unlikely that port security can be helpful. So I stuck precisely with 40-something minutes, so I'm going to stop my presentation here. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them, and I do hope it was clear. Port economy and port security are really complex, so I do hope I didn't give too much for granted in my talk, but if there are any questions, happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Anna. I find the topic incredibly interesting, as you say, incredibly complex. And here's the copy of the book. We have it in the library as well. We also have it as an ebook.
Yeah.
I see, Kettle, do you have a question?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. Maybe more a comment than a question. Well, I have questions but that's related to topics you haven't touched upon today. As you might know, the UNODC and the World Customs Organization, we have what we call the Container Control Program, CCP, where we work together, but we work a lot more on the frontline level than what you describe now, I think. There were some interesting elements that we see in our in the ports where we establish dedicated targeting units, but also in the ports we cooperate with, like for instance in Europe, Rotterdam and Antwerp, they are given, but we also work somewhat with Spain and UK and other ports. the port you mentioned yourself, and I'm always afraid of saying that name to Italians because I always pronounce it bad. Giaio Tauro.
Yes.
Yeah. We work somewhat with them as well, but because they are a huge transit port for us and for shipments going to Southeast Europe, where we have several units. So I'll get a copy and I will read your book, and I will probably come back with more questions when I have the book in front of me. But have you done something similar, or did you speak or interview somebody related to transit shipments or free trade zones? Because we see that especially, well, transit is a challenge in itself because some ports they simply lack the legal framework to stop a transit container. But also the free trade zones is a challenge for us, and some of them are huge around the world. And I'm not going to name and shame, but we see several free trade zones or free ports where containers go in a large number and they simply disappear.
Yeah, I haven't done the research on Freeport myself. Alexandria has, because she's working on that specifically. We do touch upon it briefly in the book as well, but you'll find that in the fourth chapter.
Yeah.
So yes, but if you don't mind, I will be in touch with you if we can have a chat specifically on certain topics, because I'm very interested in whether in the container program. I did try to get in touch, I think at some point, but I wasn't successful. I don't know, someone didn't reply to me, so I just let it go.
I'm sure that's me.
No, I don't think it was you. I would remember the name. So, but yeah, it would be good to have a chat for the next projects and for Piraeus as well, where I'm sure is an interesting is an interesting port for you. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, the one of the challenges in the EU is that they have, in a way, as far as I have understood, adopted a strategy that the first entry point is the one responsible for the targeting and control and whatever. And of course, there's a huge difference between the EU countries as well, related to capabilities, capacities, the skills, experience, whatever. So we are not working that much with Piraeus, but we have some of our shipping lines, or the shipping lines we try to establish a cooperation with. They have, let's say, a private targeting center in Piraeus, and for us it's of course important to work with them, because we work on the documentation, the commercial documents following the containers. Yes. That's where we select our containers for physical examinations.
Well, if you've been to Gioia Tauro, I think that's that already. For me, it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. So that's a port that for me has been. I grew up around the port. I saw it growing up. We grew up together, because the port only, in 1994 became operational, and I was born in 1985. So I literally grew up around the port, and now, it's a challenging. It became huge, and for various reasons, and obviously for natural resources, it's unprecedented for Italy, but the territory is what it is. So, But thank you. I'll get in touch with you if you don't mind. I'll ask. I don't know your email, but I'm sure I can.
That's easy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kettle, and thank you, Anna. I was really curious about, you sort of stated many times throughout this presentation that too many people in a port, or too many authorities, and can get really complex. And you stated it, but New Jersey has 19 different institutions working together. I think it's very exciting you got to do this field work and actually go to the ports. Did you see some ports sharing intelligence and working together better, or was it equally chaotic?
I think different ports, in terms of security networks, some ports are better than others in the sense that they kind of share, they treat each other as equals in a way. So in Antwerp, for example, they have these security networks where everyone participates and everyone talks. And Antwerp has, they're trying to make the best of a horrible situation, being targeted as one of the major entry points for cocaine in Europe. They kind of have to do something, and they kind of came together in a beautiful harmonic way. I don't know whether that works or not, but on the face of it, it seems. In the US, the situation is different because not in the US, in New York, the situation is different because of the Port Authority, which is a very weird beast. So it's an authority that sits on two states, New Jersey and New York, and kind of is like a gigantic thing that has. Not everything that they do is related to the port, but they dictate quite a lot on how the arrangements in the port work should work. And I found in the United States, in New York specifically, that some authorities are more important than others. So even if you if you are the DEA and you want to go into the port and do an operation, or you are the FBI, you still have to go through CBP, to Custom Border and Protection, because they are the one who physically can open the container. So having a relationship with them is, most of the time, as it has been described to me, as an informal relation. So I know someone and I can pick up the phone and make the call, not because it doesn't work formally, but because sometimes it needs to be quicker. So I do have a feeling, also because of the massive nature of the port of New York and New Jersey, that this can somehow get in the way. And for example, New York PD, NYPD doesn't have any type of interest in the port most of the time. They do know what's happening around, but the port is not their business. I think everyone decides which territory which battles to fight at some point, but it depends on the port. The Port of Genova has a top-bottom approach. So because Italy has a top-bottom approach where the port security is handled at the regional level. So Genova shares security with other 3 ports in the area. The PFSO all know each other in the area. So when there is a port authority at the regional level, it kind of helps to share across ports, but not necessarily across nations. So I think it's really, it's like all different networks running in parallel with one another. So extremely complex. I entered this topic without knowing the kind of complexity. So it kind of took me by surprise, and now, I can't let it go because it's a truly interesting, fascinating topic. So.
Absolutely. I see Adam has his hand up. Please go ahead, Adam.
Thank you. Let me take my hand down. Just want to piggyback on what you said, Professor. But we are aware of different, well, first of all, I work with the KEDL, with the Container Control Program, the UNODC WCO Container Control Program. And we have been working or communicating with different groups. We've talked previously to the terminal operators. So they have a group, the shipping lines, the World Shipping Council. So we're trying to look at other mechanisms that are, for lack of a better term, cross-cutting. There's also that balance, and that's one of the things that we try to focus on with our program, that the facilitation of legal trade. There's more legal trade than illegal, so we try to balance that enforcement activity with the units that we assist member states establish. So there are some concerns, certainly from the dynamics of the port and a relationship with other ports, and we're trying to look at it in a regional context from the enforcement side, and then from the public side with different organizations that there are several operators of terminals. There's a couple that are world over. However, there are nuances when you get to a particular port. What kind of safety vest you have to wear, or what kind of check-in process. So depending on the nature of that region and that country. So there are some others that we've been trying to engage with to enhance this capability of, yeah, we call it intelligence, but it's also, we try to use information because the concern with how the perception of that word intelligence, where we're not doing anything super secret. It's the sharing of information to be able to be proactive while facilitating legitimate trade. My question to add on to this is, what have you looked at as resulting with the move to blockchain technology? Because blockchain it's not new per se, but it is gaining more steam to facilitate the information, access to the information for those that need it. But it's still a work in progress. So what is your position on blockchain technology?
I can't give you an answer because I haven't looked at that, honestly. We did look at some of the cybersecurity issues, which you'll find in the book, but that wasn't my expertise, I'm afraid. Also because in a way, we followed the practitioners of our port's lead, and this didn't quite come up.
Okay.
If I can be honest. So it might be that we're missing something huge here, but honestly, I can't comment on that. Sorry.
No, thank you.
So I think it's a matter of the ports we talked to, in a way, whether or not they see that. I think most people are still just concerned with their daily physical life, in a way.
Okay. No, that makes sense. Thank you.
Sorry. I always hate when I can't answer a question.
No, but still, we appreciate you being here with us. We see we have 2 more minutes. I'm just quickly, because the book does touch on in the end, and as you mentioned, looking at the impact of COVID and Brexit on, clearly they've had a massive impact on supply chains. Do you think this is an opportunity for organized crime with a bit of disruption in the supply chain, or are they as debilitated as regular commerce?
I think some are and some aren't. I mean, I don't like to look at organized crime as a monolith entity. It's not. Obviously, there are different groups with different capacities. And even in the groups I work on more, which is the Ndrangheta groups, some of them had to change their business because they were severely impaired by COVID. Some others were happily actually riding the wave. So it really depends. I think what I've seen, and we do have, so we have 2 problems here. On one side, and people in this room know it better than I do, but on one side, the shipping routes have been fragmented during COVID, but port economy has never actually stopped. So it's not like things did not arrive, they just arrive in different ways, whether or not a shipment used to, a ship used to do 10 ports of calls, they might have brought it down to 5, they might have stopped changed their routes and stop in France rather than go all the way to Rotterdam or in Spain rather than going to Liverpool. So different ports of different ending and destination ports and some delays. But this has not, in a way, has not been seen with organized crime up until at least June or July of 2020, because in a way, in the same way as legal business works, there was not as much disruption in the port economy to touch upon new orders. So the orders that kept arriving from a, let's say, cocaine perspective were still the orders that had been placed in 2019. So they kept arriving one way or the other, even with delays, as they were supposed to. So the only adaptation was with the logistics upon arrival. When the pandemic hit the other side of the world, so the Latin American countries, which means difficulty to actually bring the cocaine to the port of shipment because gasoline was missing or because people were sick with COVID, then that became a different issue. But by that time, even slowing down on some of the distribution wasn't necessarily an issue because there was already cocaine that had been stocked in Europe that could be used to fill in the distribution chain. So in a way, I think for organized crime, it's always a matter of thinking on your feet and kind of adapting. And I haven't seen that much. Cocaine has not been disrupted. Other trades have been, but cocaine definitely, as far as we see, hasn't. So.
Thank you for that. Well, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Anna, for joining us.
Anna, and I will follow with Ketil and Adam for the program. Thank you so much for the questions.
Please, yeah, please do that.
Yes, I will also send you the other report, which might be more easy, quicker and nicer to read in a way.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Cool. Excellent. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
Bye.